I'm going to have the pleasure now of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Nancy Love. She's a good friend of mine, and I'm really thrilled that she's here with us today to talk about this topic. Nancy Love is professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Michigan, where she has also served as the chair of the department. She's also an adjunct professor at the Institute of Biotechnology at Addis Ababa University. Nancy has advised over 70 graduate students and postdoctoral research candidates. She has co-authored over 100 peer-reviewed papers, chapters, and reports. If you pick up the 2011 textbook edition of Biological Wastewater Treatment, the third edition, Nancy is a co-author on that cover. We had the pleasure of interviewing some wastewater treatment engineers, and when they found out we were working with Nancy Love, they got very excited and pulled the book right off the shelf. Nancy has presented at over 250 conferences. This is another one. And she has held leadership positions in multiple organizations, including the Water Environment Federation, the International Water Association, the Association of Environmental Engineering and Science Professors. She is a fellow of all three of these organizations. She has been the past president of the AEESP, and she's been a distinguished lecturer for them as well. Nancy, I recall just a few years ago that she organized a conference for over 700 members of the AEESP at her university in Michigan. It was quite a big event. She's a licensed professional engineer in the state of Michigan, a board certified environmental engineer, and she's received many, many awards. I'm not going to name all of them, but I'm going to just name a few of the awards that Nancy has received. In 1995, she received the National Science Foundation Career Award. And later in 2001, she received the Paul S. Bausch Award for Innovation in Applied Water Quality Research. I mentioned this particular award because I was down in Virginia with Nancy at the Water Environment and Reuse Foundation headquarters last year. And I walked past the wall of all the recipients of this award, and there's Nancy's photo as the first one. And that's pretty exciting and outstanding. But what was really more thrilling for me was to realize that 5 of her students are also recipients of this important and distinguished award. Nancy's received the WEF Rudolph Industrial Waste Management Medal for noteworthy accomplishments in industrial waste management, and the WEF Gordon Mascu Fair Distinguished Engineering Educator Award in 2011. I know Nancy as a friend and a colleague, and I know that her career is a really big career in this field. She's known for championing women and students of the global majority in science and engineering. She's passionate about inclusion and using her position to open doors for others. In the face of our current struggles in the United States for equity and justice, Nancy assumed the lead position in her department as the chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. I know she is passionate about this issue. I've had the great pleasure of conversations with her over the years, which have shown me how she thinks about her work and her relationships. She purposefully engages with all of her students and colleagues to empower them, to support their best selves. She leads and she creates confident young people who become leaders. Nancy's influence reaches far and wide because she has exceptional qualities as a scientist, an engineer, an educator, and a leader. And perhaps most importantly, I know Nancy to be kind, caring, invested, honest, responsible, thoughtful, and hopeful. She's my colleague and friend, and I've had the joy of working as a team member with her since 2014. I know she has a lot to say about reclaiming urine as a resource. So it gives me great pleasure at this time to co-host the screen with you and share the screen and to turn this over to Dr. Nancy Love. Thank you for joining us.
Wow, Kim, that was amazing. Thanks so much. And it's been an honor, certainly, and will continue to be an honor to work with you and the others at Richards. You're a good friend and you're an inspiration to me. I am going to share my screen and give me just a moment here to get this correct. I believe it will work here now. You should be seeing my screen. Thumbs up? Okay, terrific.
Are we going to stop our video and mute? Yeah. Can everyone please stop their video and mute and use the chat for whatever you need to do for questions?
Okay, so I'm really excited to be able to be part of this today, and to also see, move this out of the way as well, see the virtual version of the Rich Earth Summit. This is, I've been to all of them, like all of the official ones, I think, except for the very first meeting when they kind of conceived of some of this. And it's really been wonderful to see this grow. And what I'm going to do today is talk about, thinking through where we've been, where we are, and where we could be. And I'm going to start, before I go into my slides, by acknowledging, first of all, Will Tarpe, who may be live right now, or he'll be watching asynchronously later. And I'm going to use a scenario that Will has worked on, and we've been working on for something that we hope to get out later this year. And that is thinking through the scenario, get the right one here, of 2070. We don't make any changes. We continue to do things as they are now. We're going to talk about the person Will, who awakes to his alarm going off and announcing his day. I think I have the wrong, pardon me, I've got two sheets here. Okay, so it's Will. Okay, he's recently moved from Bakersfield, California to San Francisco, and he's adjusting to city life. Water scarcity struck quickly in the Central Valley due to decades of periodic drought. He's one of the final evacuees to strike out from more water-rich areas. Based on extreme weather events and water availability, state governments were constantly using cutting-edge predictive models to move people to go to where water would be available. Back where he was from in Bakersfield, there was not enough water to have on-demand water on the tap. Instead, each neighborhood was notified when water would be distributed each day. Will and his siblings were the first generation of their family in over a century to experience life without continuous running water. It was hard to believe the stories of his parents that they told about the former glory of the Central Valley, irrigated green fields that produced the majority of the United States crops. Besides water, the region lacks fertilizers that promoted high yields. Based on waning phosphorus supplies worldwide and the periodic drought, the San Joaquin Valley was de-emphasized as a productive cropland for national importance back in 2040. Yields had plummeted then, as had the agricultural economy of seasonal farmlands, machinery producers, fertilizer producers, and crop transportation. During Will's last months there, the city council was deciding whether to promote wastewater irrigation to recycle nutrients, even in a dilute form, as a last-ditch effort to save some of the crops. So what I want to talk about today is how we don't get there. We're going to take a little bit of a journey to talk about where we are and where we could be. And I know that those of you who are on this webinar are here because you believe in a different future. So let's start, and I'm going to get myself a laser pointer here. So I have it. Okay, and I think there we go. So there are these terms, linear economy and circular economy, and we're going to use that here. And this notion of a linear economy is what we do today. With regard to nutrient flows and food flows into our communities, we have different forms of nitrogen and phosphorus production. Nitrogen comes through the Haber-Bosch process, an energy-intensive process to produce nitrogen-based fertilizers. Phosphorus comes from mining. We produce those fertilizers, we apply them to our crops, and then most of those nutrients enter our communities and cities through the food. We then process it in various ways as a wastewater or a waste biosolid. And it goes back into the environment, either in the form of an effluent or through gaseous means. Now, what's going on inside the community, which is where most of my professional life has sat, is in the water process, in the water processing and wastewater treatment, water treatment. So let's think about where we've been and where we've evolved from in terms of those technologies. So back in, the early 60s, in the United States, at least before the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, which were signed in the early 70s, we had certainly back earlier after World War II and so forth, started to implement more centralized treatment of water and wastewater. And this is showing you a simple version, a simple form of the early phases when our target was to remove pathogens and protect our water sources and to remove organic carbon. So you don't need to focus on the details. The point is that we had these fairly simplified systems that dealt with the water flow from wastewater that came through our cities, and then the sludges that were produced sludges or biosolids. And those systems have evolved not by transforming them dramatically, but by adding on to that backbone of conventional centralized treatment that uses multiple barriers. So, in the 70s, we had our regulations in the US that moved us to higher levels of organic carbon transformation and the nitrogen conversion, not removal, but conversion. So the nitrogen coming into the treatment plant from our human waste was in the form of ammonia and organic nitrogen. It might get converted to nitrate. Some of it is lost or removed, I should say, into the biosolids, but that's still going into the environment in the form of biosolids. And then as we've evolved from there into some of our most advanced systems today, we have a system like this, where it's much more sophisticated. It is, again, this same backbone, but now we have different environments. Some have air added to them, some do not have air. But in using this kind of a biological approach, we can now remove nitrogen and remove it by putting it back into the atmosphere as a nitrogen gas. And we can recover phosphorus through various means, but it might be recovered into a solid form that can then be land applied as a Class A biosolid, meaning it could be used on food crop. So this is a very sophisticated treatment plant. This particular schematic that I'm showing you is a treatment plant in Loudoun County, Virginia, that produces an effluent that is cleaner than the river into which it discharges. So we can do this. We have the technology, we have the ability. So, well, how is it translated in terms of the water resource recovery facilities, as we call them today, as opposed to wastewater treatment plants in the United States? So a survey that was conducted last year, and I thank Tanya Rausch-Williams from Crollo Engineers for this slide. The Water Environment Federation is starting to track resources recovered by water resource recovery facilities in the United States. And you can see that there's been quite an effort over the last couple decades focused on biosolids and recovering them as a conditioner for soils, whether it's Class A or Class B, where Class A, again, would be for food crop, Class B would be a lower quality biosolid, but still beneficial to the soil. So there's been a lot of effort there, and you can see the result of that in terms of how much of those sludges that are produced by treatment plants can be recovered as biosolids. And increasingly in some parts of the country, as in California, in Will's story, we see that water recovery is becoming an emphasis, although we're still only recovering about 7% of it for indirect potable reuse, and now there's increasingly work on even potable reuse happening in our southwest US, and then some very important examples possibly elsewhere. Energy recovery has been a big emphasis, and some of that's just internal to the plants in terms of how they convert or recover energy and use it within the plant itself. But you can see where nitrogen and phosphorus are in terms of our progress. We've certainly made more progress with phosphorus. We have ways of doing that have been commercialized into large-scale systems, but our nitrogen recovery, not just removal, but recovery, is quite low. So we've got a lot of work we can do at our treatment plants, and we can do that by continuing to modify at the plant and squeeze more out at the plant or we can rethink it. And we're going to go down the path of rethinking it in terms of how we contribute to growing these two bars on this graph. So why are phosphorus and nitrogen particularly important? Let's talk about them from the standpoint of global markets and even locally for where we are. So I'm showing you a couple images. I want to start over here on the left. I put a picture of myself here because that's where I'm sitting right now. So just to orient you, this is Lake Erie, and this is Lake St. Clair, which I have blown up on the top here. So you have Detroit, Michigan right here. Ann Arbor is pretty much west of Detroit. So I'm sitting over here. So I'll get rid of my little picture. And what you're seeing in the green, these satellite images show you some of the algal blooms, including harmful algal blooms that are routinely happening within the water bodies of the Great Lakes, where I live, the largest freshwater system that really we rely upon and will increasingly rely upon within this country for sure. Much of this is attributed to, in fact, most of it is attributed to agricultural activity. You can see here in the Lake St. Clair, the Canadian side is almost all agriculture, and you see where those blooms are. Over here is all urbanized, and you see that you still have issues along that urbanized side of it. So it's certainly agriculture, but we have to consider the role of the treatment plants in contributing to these types of overloads of nutrients into our environment that can produce harmful algal blooms, as in Lake Erie, where Toledo, Ohio here is very vulnerable in terms of their drinking water intake being out in the lake, having to shut down a few years ago when that harmful algal bloom became so prominent that it overwhelmed the intake. What I'm showing over here is, a curve that many of you have seen, this notion of peak phosphorus, and while the timeline is debated and adjusted, the point is that our phosphorus production, which is a mined phosphorus, is increased with the increase in population in the world. And that at some point out there, we're going to hit a point where it's harder to get that mined available phosphorus. And we have to be recovering that phosphorus. If we look down here on the bottom, this map of the world shows you where the phosphorus reserves are in the world. And if you happen to exist in a place where you have a reserve, that's wonderful. But if you exist in a country that doesn't have a reserve and may not have relations with a country that does have a reserve, having access to those markets is a vulnerability that we need to consider, because if you don't have phosphorus, you don't have food. So pardon me, we have to continue to consider the possibilities of how we recover this phosphorus that we are using once through in that linear system. In terms of nitrogen, this is a graph of the world where the dots represent dead zones, being areas in marine systems where there has been such an overgrowth of life and so forth from the nutrients, the algae and other elements that have consumed the oxygen in the water body, preventing many aquatic species from surviving, including another food form, fish and seafood. So we have, pretty much anywhere along a coast, the dead zones are pretty prominent, and that again has to do with this nutrient wash off into the marine systems. In the marine systems, we often think of nitrogen being that limiting nutrient. And so here we're looking at the number of dead zones over time. Of course, some of this increase is due to enhanced monitoring and reporting. But the bottom line is that this is happening at an increasing frequency. And we even see it in some of the freshwater systems, both due to phosphorus, but there's also a role of nitrogen. I'm going to share with you a fairly technical slide next, but I just want to emphasize the following. While phosphorus is considered that limiting nutrient in freshwater systems, such as the Great Lakes where I live, and phosphorus removal is mandated by the treatment plants in order to in recognition of this, we do have impacts due to nitrogen. So while phosphorus can create the bloom, nitrogen can change the toxicity of the bloom. And that is something that is being increasingly studied by freshwater scientists who are recognizing that it's not just phosphorus we have to be dealing with from an environmental impact standpoint in the freshwater systems, it's also nitrogen. And so we're going to see some changes, I believe, already seeing some changes in the Great Lakes region with regard to nitrogen removal at centralized facilities. We also have to consider markets, and again, I showed you kind of availability, not only of the mined phosphorus, but even produced nitrogen fertilizer products, and how economic global markets impact availability of those fertilizers. This shows up through 2017. I don't have an updated version today, but this shows the impact of kind of world market upset on international fertilizer prices. So the blue here, the big curve here is diammonium phosphate. We have urea and we have potassium chloride. So the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium forms of fertilizers that are critical to our crops. And you can see this disruption was dramatic back in the 2008 world market collapse. And what that meant was that certain parts of the world in particular did not have access to fertilizers because it was already difficult to access fertilizers. And when prices change this dramatically, fertilizers become a luxury, frankly, and are not able to obtain them. I know with my colleagues in Ethiopia who I've worked with, where they meet a fairly small percentage of fertilizer demand, maybe 10 to 20% of the demand, this becomes a non-starter in terms of continuing to have access when prices change like this. The point is that we're quite vulnerable to price changes when we have world market disruptions as we're having right now. And so that changes access to fertilizer, it changes access to food. So we have to produce and come up with options for more localized fertilizer commodity markets. So I'm going to use this term resource efficiency, which is really where we're headed. I've talked about water resource recovery facilities, and the common term is resource recovery, which is a technology-driven term. We're looking at how we develop the technologies to recover those resources. But I want to think of it in terms of efficiency, in terms of the communities we exist within. As I showed you in the early slide, you know, the nutrients are really entering our community in the form of food. And so if we think about what is resource efficiency, I'm going to talk about what is resource inefficiency. Now this is a busy slide and I don't expect you to look at all the details on the colors on the right, but let me just talk you through it. The various studies that I have on the bottom, and I can make these slides available to the Rich Earth folks so you can look these up yourself. But a couple of different studies, there have been others since in addition to these, to give you some examples. So one study was looking at kind of Europe generally about the percentage of applied phosphorus or phosphorus applied to crop that actually reaches the consumer. That study showed about 10%. So where does the rest of that phosphorus go? It goes into inefficiencies in agricultural application. It goes into runoff. It goes into loss of crop from field to market. And it goes to, you know, others in the market itself. So similarly, a study in Toronto looking at nitrogen found that 60% of the nitrogen was unrecovered that entered into their markets, and it went into the environment. And this image on the right that I'm showing you is from a paper that was led by Ming Xu, a colleague of mine here at the University of Michigan that I participated in, looking at the city of Detroit. And it's showing you nitrogen and phosphorus. This big red arrow is really obvious. This is a solid waste management system where they actually incinerate waste. And that system is going down. So if you look at nitrogen, the next largest discharger is wastewater. Detroit does not have to remove nitrogen. It doesn't have to convert nitrogen. Detroit puts out about 13,000 metric tons of nitrogen a year, or almost 15,000 English tons of nitrogen a year into the Detroit River. And that's based on its current permitted liquid effluent. And that doesn't consider the stormwater nitrogen and phosphorus contributions as well. So this is a big contributor to that water system I showed you that goes eventually to Lake Erie. Phosphorus, same thing, although we have phosphorus removal, so it's a much less of a factor in terms of the effluent into the river, although still important. And in this study, we showed that 58% of the food-related nitrogen and 70% of the food-related phosphorus that goes into Detroit ends up in the environment in a reactive form. And the thing I want to say is that Detroit isn't unusual. It's not unusual. And so those kinds of numbers are the ones I want to share with you that describe what I mean when I say resource inefficiency. So what we have certainly in centralized systems and the developed economies is very high-end treatment systems that are able to remove nitrogen or capture phosphorus using commercialized strategies, chemical precipitation. We can use biological phosphorus removal to accumulate it in the biosolids. We can precipitate it out of struvite. But all of those are inefficient because we've done them after we've had that concentrated nutrient, nitrogen and phosphorus that leaves the human body. It's been diluted heavily. It goes to a centralized facility where we then either convert it into a form that goes into the environment, or we reconcentrate it and then try to turn it into a useful product. That is an inefficient way of going. We know how to do it, but it's not efficient. So how do we turn this linear nutrient cycling into something that is resource efficient versus what it is now, which is resource inefficient? How do we turn it into a circular process? So that's where we are. And I do have a black slide. Your computer isn't malfunctioning. I want to take a moment to pause and make the following point, that we understand the infrastructure that we've built, all the money we've invested in what is a high functioning system in the developed economies of the world. We know how to push our nitrogen back into the atmosphere and capture our phosphorus into a somewhat concentrated recovered product that can be land applied, but the system is not efficient. So I'm going to share a quote with you, and this says very simply, if you know what the right thing is, you just keep working at it. Well, that doesn't sound very difficult to understand. It's kind of obvious, but let me give you some context. This was a quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's a Supreme Court Justice in the United States, a beloved Supreme Court Justice in the United States, in February of this year. And she was talking about the US Constitution, our 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. It was ratified 100 years ago in 1920. That was after about 100 years of activism and suffragettes working very hard to push for that right to vote. 100 years of advocacy to get there. So we've certainly been thinking about urine as a resource for more than 100 years, but going from a very kind of a momentum towards the kind of technologies we have in place in centralized systems that work, but are not resource efficient, to a more resource efficient approach in our communities is that battle we're in right now. And we're in that process, and I don't want it to take 100 years. But all of you here who are listening to this, I think, are part of that movement to bring this dramatic change, which I would call more of a revolution than the evolution we saw in the treatment processes I shared with you. So why do we care about this? This is the data and the numbers that many of you know well. We have most of the nutrients that kind of come into our communities, again, in the form of food, and those that ultimately enter into our bodies, of those nutrients, the nitrogen and phosphorus, most of it leaves in our urine. So a typical wastewater in the United States might have 40 milligrams per liter of nitrogen in the wastewater effluent that is received at the treatment plant after it's been diluted through flushing and so forth. But the urine actually, as it leaves our body, has between 6,000 and 8,000 milligrams of nitrogen per liter in it. So that's dramatic dilution that has occurred. Phosphorus, similarly, about 60% or so is in our urine. And then depending upon the micronutrients, this number varies, but some pollutants or pharmaceuticals, even a very high percentage of them are actually in our urine. So What can urine diversion and reprocessing do for us? It can certainly enhance food security, and I've tried to make that point here at the beginning by recovering the nitrogen and phosphorus in wastewater. It can reduce the energy associated with fertilizer production and nutrient removal from the water, as well as some of the other environmental impacts associated with both of those methods. It can reduce water consumption by reducing flushing, and it can improve water quality overall. So there are a lot of benefits to this. What we're up against is existing infrastructure, kind of the momentum of that, as well as the notion of centralized systems being more economically efficient. I think those are the kind of the points that we're countering. So what if urine never became sewage or septage? So there are different ways it can be processed. And in the work that we've been part of with Rich Earth Institute here at the University of Michigan, we've looked at both of these. One is the notion of centralized processing, meaning you collect it at the building scale. You might store it at the building scale. You transport it in some way to a centralized processing facility. You create fertilizer, transport that fertilizer for application, produce the food that we then reconsume. And this is what's going on basically in Brattleboro in terms of the process there. But we could think about it happening even in larger communities than Brattleboro, and that's where we want to head to, is different technologies and policy changes and ordinance needs along the way. Building scale processing would be where we have the collection, but then we process it in the building to create the fertilizer, or at least long ways towards creating the fertilizer, transport it, apply it, and then go to food. So this is what we've been working on in our collaborative project. I'll point out to you that our project has multiple components to it, and I'll walk through some of those. Some of them include modeling efforts, and those are still underway. The processing themselves, the different technologies associated with this, risk analysis, perception analysis, and I'm just going to introduce you to, and many of you know Yuri, who's out there and listening in. He's on Twitter as well. So let's talk a little bit about just, we have collection, and I don't work so much in this area of toilets. I know that several of you do, and we'll hear about that over the next 3 days. The toilet in the middle is the one that we have here at the University of Michigan that is in the women's bathroom, and then we have a waterless urinal in the men's. And I know Tove's on. I'm real excited about her Laufin toilet, but this is just another version of a toilet, and I hope somebody will spend some time talking about that. But we have certainly innovation happening in the toilet arena to enhance urine separation and also to make it more acceptable, I think, to both people who would use it and make it work within the markets that exist. We have various forms of processing, and again, this is where I think many of you, and I'm excited about the agenda coming after me in terms of looking at all the different researchers who are working on different forms of processing. And I won't spend time on this other than to say that we've certainly worked on some of this. We're working less on this in our project, and we're moving towards some of those other areas I'll kind of close with. But, with the freeze concentration that Abe Noah Hayes has been developing, we have kind of some of the ion exchange work that's been done by Will Tarpe, and I think some of his students and collaborators are going to be talking about this. Struvite precipitation using an Ostera type system. This is urine derived struvite that came through a Ostera type system done by Hampton Roads Sanitation District. We've been looking at plasma and so forth. But what are we trying to do generally? So you can ignore a lot of the text here. This gives you details for those who are really on the tech side of this. But ultimately, when we collect locally at the toilet and we're trying to process it, there are 3 goals we have. One is to concentrate further, even though it comes out of our body at maybe nitrogen of 6 to 8 grams per liter. To be competitive with field applied fertilizers, we still have to concentrate it beyond then. So it's convenient for the farmer to apply these products single pass to get the amount of nutrient on the land that they need to. So concentration technologies are one of the technology development areas, and I've listed a few here. I know we're going to see some electrochemical systems discussed today as well, and maybe others. We need odor reduction. We need to be sure that it is not aesthetically unpleasing in terms of the processing, and what the product that ultimately comes out needs to be something people can work with. And people are concerned about the chemicals or biological contaminants. And so we've spent time on all of these. I'll make a few comments about each of them, but that's where the technology push is. And there's so many of you making progress on that. And I think that that's needed. We need to get these technologies further along and then scaled up to higher technology readiness levels. There's application, and this is one of Richard's farmers applying to his hayfield using their system. And we know that there are examples around the world where these types of programs are underway to convert urine to fertilizer and then actually land apply it. So this isn't new. It's been going on more than that 100 years I talked about. But actually getting it to the point where we put it all together with the technologies, allowing both centralized and building scale, using multiple technologies potentially in series to achieve concentration and odor reduction and contaminant removal is kind of the new thrust. So what we've been doing with Rich Earth is both converting urine into fertilizer using different technology approaches. We've used a farm, their research farm in Vermont, to do experiments with lettuce and carrot, and also including lysimeters here where we can track the nutrients and the pharmaceuticals that might be remaining in the fertilizer product, in the soil, in the leach water, in the crops themselves. And we still have some of our work underway. We're getting ready to do kind of a final trial on this fall. And so we're looking forward to putting out some of those research products so that you can see them. I will talk briefly, generally, what we're seeing. But we also have to go beyond food. Part of what we are looking at is really getting beyond the perception, understanding the risk and getting beyond the perception problems associated with using urine as a fertilizer. And one way to do that is to look at using it as a fertilizer for non-food applications. So we were disappointed this year when our pea on peonies didn't happen. Ann Arbor is the North American cultivar of the peonies, where you have different peony species from around the world that bloom in June and July. And this is from a prior year. We were not allowed to walk around the peonies like this year. And we have a partnership with the Peony Garden to actually apply some of the fertilizer to soils that are nitrogen limited. So we'll be doing that next year. And sorry, my child has walked in, so I had to get him out. He's supposed to be in school. So next year in 2021, we hope to try this again. But the peonies are beautiful, and I know they'll love the urine. So one of the two areas where we're spending most of our time, I'd say, here in the last this coming year is really on risk analysis and perceptions. And we've spent time in the past on this as well. And I want to talk a little bit about this. So what we've been doing over the last few years between EPA funded work, US EPA funded work, the National Science Foundation funded work, has been gathering information that help us understand these perceptions of risk, and to then put that into more of a risk framework, which is where we're headed next. So I'll just summarize from that vast amount of research, various papers that are out, or some of them are in review, where we're at. We know that enteric bacteria are rapidly inactivated and hydrolyzed urine, enteric bacteria being those that come through our gut. We know that some non-enteric bacteria thrive in hydrolyzed urine. And so as with other products, you know, it has a microbiome, and that microbiome is something we need to understand in terms of how it affects the soils and the crops that it's applied to. We do have a student, Lucinda Lee, who is doing her dissertation kind of looking into this space of understanding the impact of urine-derived fertilizers on soil health. We've done quite a bit of work with viruses. Krista Wigginton, a colleague of ours at the University of Michigan in this research area, is an expert on viruses. She's very busy with coronavirus research right now, but we've done quite a bit of work on viruses that are found in urine. The polyomavirus is the most common, a virus that is not clinically as well understood or studied as it could be. But we know that that through our work that viruses appear to be rapidly inactivated, both the polyoma and other types of viruses, both enveloped and non-enveloped. They can be rapidly inactivated or rendered incapable of replicating in hydrolyzed urine. And that's really important to our risk analysis. We've looked at antibiotic resistance genes and their ability to transfer from one of those non-enteric or any bacterium that might have remained in the urine to other bacteria. And in the hydrolyzed urine, again, high pH urine, we found that those antibiotic resistance genes lose their ability to move from a host into another organism, which is very important. So if you have antibiotic resistant bacteria in the urine, and if you use a hydrolysis process where the pH goes high, those bacteria will lose their ability to transfer the gene into other bacteria. And that stops the antibiotic resistance transfer, which is, I think, a positive thing from the standpoint of reducing risk. And we know that pharmaceuticals can be removed effectively through activated carbon absorption. The EVAG team have done quite a bit of work on this. They've moved to a commercial product. We've used their approach in our work, and we see the same thing. And so we know that we have that ability to remove the pharmaceuticals. I think there's some other technologies that some of you may be working on to go further at looking at other ways, because you then still have an activated carbon kind of waste product you have to deal with the pharmaceuticals on it. But we know we can get rid of them, and I'll leave it there. So this is one of Abe's slides I've borrowed. He's shown this many times, but I think it also helps to make the point that there is no zero in contaminants. We do have risks in everything we do in life. And so what we need to do is we need to understand that risk and put it into perspective. And so this is an example from urine that has not been treated with activated carbon in terms of the amount of caffeine, for instance, that ends up in lettuce. And so the notion is you would have to eat one salad a day for 2,000 years to get the same amount of caffeine from 1 8-ounce cup of coffee. So this is the type of crafting and kind of translation that we need to put our data into context and put it out there transparently, sharing what we know, and also knowing that we have the ability to remove those pharmaceuticals to make people comfortable so that they would use products that have been fertilized with urine-derived fertilizer products. Some of the efforts we've done kind of looking at the system scale include a life cycle assessment analysis. And we have a report that was put out by the Water Research Foundation. We have another paper that is now in the final rounds of having been accepted at Environmental Science and Technology that will go out shortly, I believe. But in this work, we compared urine separation and processing using either ion exchange as an approach or concentration and activated carbon treatment as approach versus conventional, meaning we allowed the nutrients to not be captured, the urine was not captured, and we compared it to what would be called a conventional treatment plant for the regulations that are present in different parts of the United States. So we did a Virginia scenario in the Chesapeake Bay, which would be kind of state-of-the-art wastewater treatment, nitrogen and phosphorus removal technologies. We did a Vermont scenario, And we did a Michigan scenario where you would have phosphorus removal, but not nitrogen removal. And we compared the impact category from a life cycle assessment for the struvite and ion exchange technology for nitrogen and phosphorus recovery, the concentration of urine using, I think this was a membrane actually, as opposed to the freeze thaw, and then conventional. And what you see is that from this life cycle analysis, that urine separation is competitive. Urine separation processing is competitive under different scenarios using a Michigan case study or a Virginia case study where the conventional treatment plant technology changes. And this CED, which is cumulative energy demand. So we have global warming potential, energy demand, water recovery, eutrophication, and acidification. And it's the acidification where we struggle the most, the ion exchange in particular, because there's an acid processing associated with the ion exchange technology. But from a life cycle analysis perspective, we can make the argument for urine separation and urine processing is where I want to go with this. And I think there's more work needed on this. Trevor Boyer's team has also done work in this area, looking at the urine separation and different assumptions in their analysis. And I think the more of these types of analyses we have, the better we will be at having tools available to talk to different stakeholders as to why this is a valid approach that needs to be on the table for consideration. We've also looked at kind of trying to build these building scale systems. We've been working with Rich Earth Institute and Abe Noe-Hayes in particular on trying to advance how to do this. I know, again, they're doing some of this work at Arizona State as well. And now Rich Earth has a grant from the National Science Foundation to really do this locally where they can really dive into it. But in our case, we have our urine separating toilet in Ann Arbor. And then we have a urine processing room downstairs. There's Abe with one of our students. And in that room sits in a hallway where we have graduate students in a classroom. So we have to be, we've kind of done the hard thing here where we're trying to separate and process in the building using, in this case, acidification for odor control. We have a freeze concentration for our concentration step. We have automatic sensing and data logging that then goes back into Vermont, so Abe can keep track of this stuff at any moment. And trying to show kind of to the degree we have an autonomous kind of smart system and learn from our mistakes, if you will. This system is unfortunately in pause right now because of the pandemic and the low numbers of people in the building. But we look forward to getting it back online when we can. And then perceptions are really important. And there's been a lot of good work done on this by the Rich Earth and then one of our collaborators here at Michigan doing some work to try to understand where we actually stand with regard to people being receptive to urine as a fertilizer and then consuming or using products that are fertilized or treated with these urine-derived products. And so simple questions like, would you consider eating food grown with a urine-derived fertilizer, or other types of perception questions. So we have done work on this both quantitatively in terms of survey work across the US as a national survey, and then qualitatively in terms of focus groups and interviews. We have a couple papers that came out this year on that. So again, the citations are on the bottom, and then you'll have access to this. But kind of generally, one of the things that really jumped out at us that was, I'd say, surprising and in a good way, was that if you look at the overall impression of risk, less risk versus more risk, and where synthetic fertilizer versus organic fertilizer versus urine-derived fertilizer versus biosolids fell, when survey respondents were given a one-page overview of the advantages and disadvantages of each. The urine-derived fertilizer and biosolids were much closer to being less risky than synthetic fertilizer, whereby synthetic fertilizer fertilizes the vast majority of the food that we all eat. So we found this. We also know that biosolids and urine-derived fertilizers are very different. And so we have work to do to distinguish them. But this told us that, you know, we can get people to a point of listening and hearing what the advantages are of this approach. And then I think the next move is moving, you know, further left on this scale, and finding the ways in which we convey that information and successfully convince not only consumers, but markets that this can work. Oops, I wanted to bring up a quote from one of Tatiana's focus groups, where it just brings up the point about the role of antibiotics and medicines and pharmaceuticals. That point comes up over and over and over again. And even from a water utility side, I've had utility managers who've heard me talk about this say, it may even be just the fact that you can remove most of the pharmaceuticals and never send them to the treatment plant. That alone can convince utilities and their consumers that this is an approach towards resource recovery that needs to be considered. And so this notion of what happens to these pharmaceuticals is a very important one, and really needs to drive some of our work in technology development and implementation. And I just want to put a little shout out about Yuri. He is on Twitter. For those of you who enjoy Twitter, please go there and check him out. So I'm going to bring this to closure and just say this has given you an overview of the kind of work that's been going on in the United States. We're just one entity. There are others here who are doing this work, and I'm glad to see some of the speakers you're here at the summit here will tell you about that work. But I want to just shout out to Rich Earth, who has been just friends, but certainly they've inspired all of us internationally, clearly, by the participation at this summit, towards their vision of a world with clean and fertile soil, that we can reclaim the nutrients from our bodies and put them back into beneficial use. And I look forward to a long, sustained relationship with them. And I will close with this slide by just acknowledging the large number of different partners that we've had on our journey here at the University of Michigan to try to move forward with these different facets of urine separation and processing. And I also want to acknowledge the folks at Eva Tove and Kai in particular. I've always watched and always read your papers when they come out, and you're an inspiration. And I look forward to continuing to work with you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Wow, we've got a lot of wonderful comments. So there's a little moment to thank you and to take a pause and a breath, everyone, and just what a great kickoff to this summit. We have some time here, and some people have joined in and have a few questions for you, and some comments in the chat. So people might take a moment and just take a notice of that. I see our first question from someone, Stephen Vanek, about the sodium accumulation of urine in soils, and what are your thoughts about that, Nancy, about those kinds of studies and our concerns about the salts in urine and the accumulation in soils? Do you have anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, I think there are others here who have started looking at some of the desalting elements, but we haven't done that yet. So this is, as Lucinda starts moving into her research on the soils, this is one of the factors that we need to look at. We're also looking at other things, like some of the other micronutrients that actually are retained as well so there's the salt as a disadvantage. We have to think about it over long time periods. And so I agree with the fact that from a technology standpoint, we need to take that into consideration. I do know that Rich Earth is in season 5 or 6 on some of the hay fields that you have, and you haven't seen that kind of an effect. So I think having kind of some of these long-term field trials also help us, so that looking at what's happened in those soils can become part of the analysis. We haven't gotten very far experimentally down that path yet. I know that others have looked at it in localized studies, but we need to look at a longitudinal study, I think. I don't know if anybody else wants it. And I realized, Kim, I forgot one thing. I need to go back to 2070 with the urine separation, just the scenario of Will.
Oh, please do.
California, if I may.
Yes.
So kind of the change is that things have changed here for him. So now Will rolls out of bed. He has his computerized personal assistant who's giving him all of his schedule and things he needs to know. He kind of gets himself ready, washes his face like every day. He goes to his kitchen and he has his water choice, the choice of water that he's going to use depending upon if he's consuming it or if he's using it for some non-potable purpose. So we have multiple waters coming into our buildings. And so for his shower, he doesn't use a potable water. He uses a slightly lower quality water. He gets dressed and he requests his ride because he doesn't have a car, but everything is autonomous and your autonomous vehicle and it's ride share in that way. His eggs are cooking on the stove. He eats his eggs, brushes up the residual of any food with his composting vacuum, which he then is recovering these nutrients and putting them back into the system. Last spring, he sprung for the most recycled soap available, where every ingredient has been recycled through at least 10 processes. Cost a little more, but it was worth it. He leaves his house where he's got his garden out front that's being fertilized with many of the nutrients that are coming from his own house. He grabs an orange from the community orange tree that's fertilized with those nutrients. And he climbs into his autonomous car and he has, he can check his energy footprint and his water footprint and his nutrient footprint because it's all on his app. So just FYI, just we can move to this changed future with that. So thanks for giving me that moment. We'll go back to the questions.
Okay, great. It's nice to think about a vision, all that far in the future. Someone else has asked a question here about growing cooked foods. Do you think that people will be more acceptable, or growing cooked foods would be more acceptable than to fertilize raw foods such as lettuce?
I hope so. You know, although I think we need to, you know, the reason, and Kim, you know this because you were part of this decision, the reason we went to lettuce and carrots is because it's kind of the hardest, it's kind of going the furthest in terms of perception. So I think if we understood what was already going into the production of our food, that I don't think it's a big stretch to kind of go that next step. But I think the point is that cooked foods is an easy first step. Sure, and even fertilizing the grains that go into the animals that then produce our food, which is what you all are doing right now, I think is a much easier, a step removed is an easier acceptance. And in some ways, one of the questions we often get is, why even mention that it's urine derived fertilizer? You know, why do you use that term even in the naming of the product? I think that awareness is a good thing, but I think that's part of the perception work we need to do, is to figure out how we kind of get to a point where people are going to be receptive of this, but we got to open the markets. I mean, it's not just the technology push, it's the acceptance to be able to get those who produce our food to be using these approaches.
So I just want to encourage people, if you have other questions about Nancy's presentation, this is a good time to write them out in the group chat so that we can to see what those are. So does anybody here have any questions for Nancy?
So I see several of them here. And this is, I can't answer all of these, so Kim, you should help out here, but is the produce by urine fertilization called organic as per law? So this whole notion of organic topic, I think is one we've been talking about and is a little unclear because the federal kind of definition of organic in the US, as I started to read it, I became less enamored with organic, to be honest with you, because of what could be organic versus a urine-derived product, which I have much higher trust in now, given what I know. But maybe you or someone else has a comment on that. There's definitely a definition that it's not clear that a urine-derived product can fall into that category in the U.S. And I know they've been working on this in Europe as well.
So there's a lot going on in the chat. It's happening so fast.
Yeah, I can.
Can you look in there as well with me,
Yeah,
Nancy?
yeah. So I have a hypothesis that if a medicated person's urine goes to the same rich soil day after day, the soil microbes will get better and better at breaking the pharmaceuticals down. So this actually overlaps with my historical areas of research where I've done work with bacteria and industrial chemicals and how we kind of design our engineered systems to help those bacteria learn, if you will, to transform those chemicals. And so yes, in line with what you're saying, adaptation of organisms to be able to develop a pathway to be able to break down chemicals that they, that are new or outside of their normal, the chemicals that they normally see is possible. It's a function of what else is there. So how many other organic food-based nutrients are present and available. If it has a lot of those other nutrients, it might not go after pharmaceutical, but at the same time, it might by chance transform the pharmaceutical with some of the enzymes it creates for the non-pharmaceutical chemicals. So there's definitely work that one could do to look at long-term impact on that. The other concern people have is that if it's antibiotics, that we would develop antibiotic resistance. And again, we looked at the antibiotic resistance in the urine itself where the pH was high. But if it's in the soil now and you're in the soil environment, you could get some of that transfer happening and potentially in the soil. So I think there are a couple of things that we would need to look at, and that our approach has been, if we can remove it from the urine itself before we put it on as a fertilizer, then that's what will move people towards acceptance. Then that's what we should do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to stop screen sharing. So
Nancy, someone is asking, oh, that's helpful. Someone is asking, what about the depleted stream after the recovery of N and P? And I'm assuming that they're talking about the depleted influent at treatment plants and how that might impact N and P. Am I interpreting that question correctly?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
This is Fak from India. He's asking, what about the depleted stream after the recovery of N and P? And I'm thinking he means the depleted strength of the influent at wastewater treatment plants. Maybe that's not.
Oh, so I can, yeah. I mean, you won't ever remove all the nitrogen phosphorus, and Patel's right that we have to take into consideration the fact that some nitrogen and phosphorus is needed at the treatment plant. But oftentimes when we're looking at scenarios of urine separation, we're looking at some percentage of the population actually practicing this versus 100%. Even if you had 100%, I don't think we'd get there anytime soon. So I think there's still plenty of nutrients available for the wastewater processing to happen. And if there wasn't, we could, direct some of those nutrients into the plants. I think that's very manageable. If it is the depleted stream coming into the plant. I don't think we're going to get there anytime soon in terms of taking up so many nutrients that the wastewater treatment plant doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So just as an example of the 40 milligrams per liter of nitrogen that comes into a treatment plant for a conventional activated sludge plant, maybe 4 to 6 milligrams per liter of it goes into creating the biomass for the activated sludge system itself.
Mm-hmm.
Technology used.
Mm-hmm. So what about the energy saving from producing chemical fertilizers? It's quite an important part of urine recovery, replacing synthetic fertilizer production. Do you have any comments, or does anyone want to share on the chat some statistics about, what that could mean for the global chemical fertilizer production? And by the way, one question people ask us a lot about is that do we get pushback from the fertilizer industry because they can see us as competitors? And quite frankly, we haven't gotten that. We're not big enough yet to get that kind of pushback. But I think everyone's looking for this answer.
Yeah, in the first chapter of Tove's book from a few years ago, Bruce Rittman came up with some numbers and statistics, and I think maybe they're in some of Tove, your papers since then, in terms of, you know, how much energy per gram of or kilogram of nitrogen or phosphorus. And so I think depending upon the assumptions one makes, you might get some different numbers. But even with our own life cycle assessment, our analysis that we did, we see that the energy demand associated with the capture, the movement of the urine, the processing of it was less than it was for the conventional systems we compared to. One of those systems being a very high-end nitrogen and phosphorus removal technology versus just a phosphorus removal conventional approach. And so you're going to get different numbers depending upon the boundaries that one does their analysis around. But I think repeatedly we keep seeing that you can get an energy benefit from going to a urine separation approach. The challenge is the infrastructure we have in place already and changing that infrastructure. And that's one of the challenges, but that's a big challenge in terms of, you know, an infrastructure that's trillions of dollars in place. And so where do you make that transition? The transition is in the growth in cities and in the renewal. So in the utilities in the United States that we've been talking with who are interested in doing projects on urine separation, we have big cities like New York, Detroit, Denver, who have said, you know, we'd like to start looking at this for this new development area over here, or for this growth area, or as we reconsider the next phase of our treatment plant, if we're going to have some urine separation, you know, in this part of the city, how do we incorporate that into our plan? So we have utilities in the U.S. who are starting to add this to their docket for consideration. The other side of this for us is the farmers, and so we've definitely been starting to work. You know, Vermont's been doing a great job with integrating with their farmers. We have a different situation here in the state of Michigan, and we've been starting to try to have these discussions and dialogue with the farmers. Actually, I think some of our progress here may be better held by going to on-site systems, and we've started that process of working with local conservation districts and farm bureaus who are dealing with kind of septic tank, kind of septage land application issues associated with septic tanks in Michigan. About 25% of houses in the state of Michigan are on septic tanks. And we have a lot of renewal needed in those septic tanks. And if there's a way to partner septic tank renewal with urine separation, that's where the farmers are going to have more of a front seat experience with urine separation as a technology. So we're trying to take a couple of approaches here, not just with the centralized plants, but also with the on-site systems.
Nancy, I'd just like to add on to that or piggyback with you. Over the years, learning from you and Krista a lot about how centralized recovery facilities work, or wastewater treatment facilities work. You've talked a bit about cities and their growth, their expansion, and their compression or their lack of growth. And I know that that's kind of something that really opened my eyes about how a treatment plant might be built at a certain point in time with the expanded, expansion with like a certain capacity that then is either shrinks dramatically and people are leaving the city, like Detroit. So you have this enormous plant that was built at a time when there were many, many more people there, and now making it function is with so many fewer people is a big issue. And there are places that are expanding so rapidly, like New York City. There is not a square foot of extra place to add on new nutrient, new treatment technologies in some of those plants. Could you just talk a little bit about what this looks like in terms of the size of plants and their locations and different kinds of cities and needs?
So for the U.S., the Rust Belt, kind of the mid part of the United States and into the Northeast a bit, the movement of population in the United States is west and south. So the centroid of population sits in Missouri right now. And so you have growth in the south and western cities, and that growth means that a lot of the infrastructure is newer and younger. We design our in-ground tanks in these treatment systems for a design life of around 30 to 40 years. And we design large pipes for 50 to 70 years. And like for drinking water systems, for instance, many of these pipes went in after World War II. And then a lot of that in-ground treatment infrastructure went in the 70s. So what's happening in the US is we have in the places where growth was and where the population center was more in the Rust Belt and the Northeast, we have infrastructure coming of age. And so what's happening, kind of this confluence we have, is a need to renew that infrastructure, but we don't want to use 1990s, 2000s, 2010 technology. The current infrastructure bill right now kind of forces that because there's very little cost sharing from the federal government. It's not going to enable, I think, as much innovation as we'd like. So as we have that motivation as we renew and rebuild our systems. By 2070, we will have rebuilt the vast majority of that, and even by 2050, we're on that process right now. And so that's why now is the time to get urine separation and these kinds of demonstrations on the radar of those who are making decisions to rebuild now for infrastructure that's going to be lasting 30 to 50 years. That's my argument, and I think that's why we're starting to get takers from some of our biggest utilities in the country. Does that do it for you, Kim?
Yeah. I think it's important to
I saw
the context.
here. Yeah, I saw a comment I want to comment on. Somebody asked, I think what they were basically asking had to do with biosolids versus urine separation products. And I just want to make the comment. So the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that we get from the urine separation product does not provide the carbon that is often also part of biosolids. And so when we start using urine separation products as fertilizers, you get that part of it. The thing you lose when you don't use, say, a biosolid, I mean, it may be that there's you have to have a partnership with some kind of organic supplement for farms that really want that component or need that component as well for whatever reason. So I think this gets into some of the innovation space in terms of one of my key things for the innovators out there is get nitrogen based urine-derived fertilizer products into a solid form. And possibly organic is going to come with that, depending on how you choose to do it. But get it into a solid form, because that's what a lot of farmers are used to doing. They're used to putting on urea pellets. In some cases, they want it in a solid form as opposed to a liquid form. You can certainly work with the liquid form, but I think we need to have we have to look at that market and what it is that farmers use and what they're prepared to move to in terms of the form of the recovered fertilizer. But organic carbon as a partner is something that one should keep in mind as they think about these different ways of processing the urine and producing a product. We need organic carbon in some of these fields as well. And maybe that has to be applied separately, but if it comes with the package, then that could be a benefit to the farmer.
So, there's a lot of activity in the chat, which is just great. That's exactly what we're hoping for. Yeah. Someone is asking a little bit if we could take urine and just mix it with other manures from other on farms. Is there any problem with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I don't think there is. I mean, I think it's really figuring out what the nutrient needs are and what you have available. Every farm's a little different, but compost or something. I want to talk, Daniela asked about the Arizona State and the issue they had with the football field, and they were trying to use it to fertilize the field. It got a lot of publicity. Let's see, they had a little pushback from the fertilizer industry when they were trying to use their recovered fertilizer for the field. I think it was a starting point, right? And they've made some progress on it now, which is good. We've also, we're blue and maize, the yellow here. So one of the things we've hoped to do, and of course there's no football season this year, but is have piss off, after the Richard piss off, between Michigan and either Michigan State or Ohio State. I mean, we got to do one of the two, right? And I think we'll get there. But that's one way also to have that kind of recognition at some of these big sporting events.